Massachusetts to do the oral history of Dr. Seymour Cohen. Actually, after researching this, I'm really looking forward to this particular session because the curriculum vitae is so loaded with interesting things. First of all, Dr. Cohen, where were you born?
Brooklyn, New York.
Brooklyn, New York. What was Brooklyn like back during that period? You know, I can remember as a kid, every time Brooklyn would be mentioned on a radio show or a TV show or something like that, people would cheer and applaud and so forth. Can you give me kind of a thumbnail about what Brooklyn was like when you were a kid growing up?
My father was a pharmacist and was making it in financial terms, and so I did most of my early life in something called Crown Heights, which is now a transformed mix of what's the word? Fundamentalist Jews and blacks, but in the period in which I grew up, that is from 1925 to 33 or 4, 36 perhaps. Yeah, 36. It was a normal middle class, namely middle class neighborhood, close to schools, relatively open. I went to high school. I walked to my public school, 161, which was 3 or 4 blocks away. I took a trolley car to my high school, which was boys' high school in Brooklyn, and then walked a couple of blocks to my subway station, which took me for something like 8 years to my college and graduate schools.
But you know, I asked that because a young person growing up today with school buses and all that would have no concept of what the neighborhood school was like, and the fact that you might take a trolley or a bus or something like that to get to your high school. It was a different kind of environment that you had back then. Now you mentioned your dad was a pharmacist. What was his name?
Herman Cohen.
Okay. And was this in the day of the privately owned pharmacy?
Oh yes. Oh yes. 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 He owned a pharmacy. Owned a couple. That has moved to the best one, which was on Fulton Street in New York. And as the Depression developed, his store fell apart, and he had a rough time during the Depression.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that, because coming from a Depression background colors the thinking a little bit in some ways.
Not just in some ways, but in all ways.
Yeah, this is very true. How about Mom?
Well, my father was a Mason, but my mother was an Eastern Star. I've just learned about that a little bit in Falmouth, really, because I've become interested in the origins of Masonry. But anyway, she was a middle-class mother. She had two sons who were doing okay, but as the Depression developed and my father lost money and property and even the house in which my brother and I lived, she was increasingly involved in the management of the drugstore, the fountain, in which I and my brother worked.
The days when you could go in and for a nickel get a cherry Coke or a vanilla Coke or something like that?
No, I was interested in chocolate sodas with vanilla ice cream.
You know, those bring back very nice memories to me too. The old soda bar in the pharmacies. Did you work at all with your dad in the actual?
A little bit, but not enough really, and I never became very much concerned with the business of prescriptions and stuff like that.
Now you say you had a brother?
Yes.
Okay, what was his name and what did he do?
Theodore B. Cohen is a psychoanalyst in Philadelphia.
Still active?
Yes. He's 83 and still active. He's having health problems which are beginning to creep up on him.
Well, you know the old saying, getting old isn't for sissies. I'm certainly finding that out. You said that you had basically what we call neighborhood schools where you lived, as
Yes.
far as elementary school is concerned, but that you had to take public transportation to get to your high school,
Yes.
which was the Boys High School of Brooklyn.
Right.
What was your high school experience like, and could you tell me something about maybe what favorite courses were, things like that?
Well, eventually the high school led me into biology, chemistry, and tennis. And the teacher of chemistry was also the tennis coach. I also did some math, and not as well as some others, but I was involved. Anyway, the high school chemistry teacher, a man named Kastka, C-A-S-T-K-A, was also the tennis coach. And I had learned to play tennis at 9 or 10, age 9 or 10, and I was good enough to play for the high school team.
Now, when you go through high school, you have to take a whole bunch of different kinds of subjects. What was it that kind of intrigued you about biology and chemistry? What was the thing that made that a little bit special for you?
Well, it's clear now, in retrospect, that I handled those things better than I did the languages, Latin, French, etc. What was called history or civics or whatever had very little dent on me, or was just something to be through. But the science seemed to stick, whereas the languages definitely did not.
This sounds very similar to my own upbringing. So there was just basically, you did well in them, but there was also, was there a natural interest in them too?
I think it's possible that, I don't really remember. I mean, I might have begun to read the early histories which were coming out then, books by Jaffe, by who were these people that Micro de Crève. I might have begun to have read those things while I was in high school.
Were you a reader when you were
Oh,
at that?
yes, I was a reader.
In those days, what kinds of books did you read? What was the interest?
Well, I like the comics, still read them. There was, I remember clearly the first time I came across the Tarzan sequence and who was that character who went to Mongo?
The Phantom?
No. It's a famous, rather famous comic sequence. But I remember starting with those things at the age of 7, 8, 10.
Again,
Science fiction intrigued me.
it's interesting because one of the things that I think perhaps a young person that's listening to this wouldn't understand, the importance of comic books back then. And I can remember old secondhand bookstores where you could buy older comics for like 3 cents a book, and you would go in with 30 cents and come home with 10 comic books.
I didn't buy comic books. These things were coming out, you know, with the Sunday newspaper. My father brought in the Saturday night Sunday special, you see. And so the comics were a big thing on Sunday morning.
And you say in terms of literature you like science fiction.
Yes.
Okay, you know, there really wasn't an awful lot of science fiction back then. There were things like John Carter on Mars. There was
Edgar Rice Burroughs.
yes, and there was the world of Pellucidar, that interior of the Earth, another Edgar Rice Burroughs
Sure.
kind of thing. And those were, you know, very popular with essentially science-minded kids back in those days. Okay, so during your high school career then, big academic interest centered around biology and chemistry. The athletic interest centered around tennis. And you're a reader. And after school, what was your life like then? What kinds of things would you do to entertain yourself?
Well, for a while I had piano lessons, but that didn't work out too well. There was reading, there was homework. There was stoop ball, various ball games of different kinds. Eventually in high school it got to be a kind of football, baseball. But when the weather was okay, and mind you, the area in which I lived had the boys' high sports field fairly close. So that was pretty good.
Now, when you talk about stoop ball, is that old game where you'd stand away from the steps and throw the ball at the steps and feel it as it bounced off? And
Exactly.
okay. Something no young person in America today would have any clue about whatsoever. That was great fun. You know, it was a great thing to do in the,
Where did you do it?
I did it in Boston, and, you know, I still think back on watching the world go by, sitting out in the stoop sometimes in the evening, and that was part of the entertainment, and then playing the stoop ball, and sometimes we used to take the baseball cards and things like that, and we had games where we could scale those up against the wall.
I never got involved in the card games. Didn't say baseball cards or didn't get involved in
Okay, so overall it was a pretty normal growing up for a city kid
that. Yeah.
in that area of the country. Now, at a point, you had, you know, it was not that common for someone to go on beyond high school during that particular period. A lot of people from that period were considered to be educationally successful if they got through high school, and their older siblings were considered lucky if they got up through the 8th grade. Now, you were kind of the exception that way, because there was a very, very small percentage of people in the country that went on to further education. Was it always a given that you were going to do that?
Yes, my mother was rather insistent. She came from a family in which the boys had been pushed through college, but she had not. She had to go to work. And she resented that her sons were going to go to college.
Okay. Now, at some point, you had to make a decision what you were going to major in and where you were going to go. Did you talk about that some, how all of that ran through your mind?
Well, I didn't really have much choice. I was very young. When I graduated from Boys High, I think I was 15 and a half or something like that, and I made application to Columbia, but didn't get in. And I went to City College, which was an hour away in the subway. So for the next 4 years, I went underground in Brooklyn, and then emerged on 137th Street in Manhattan, and there I was.
It's CCNY.
Right.
Okay. What was the college experience like for you? Do you remember offhand what the tuition was then?
There wasn't any tuition.
Now, can you imagine someone listening to this that's just paid maybe a $34,000
Oh, I can
bill for
imagine.
their child to go to school?
Well, one reason for that is the fact that they've deprecated the quality of education at CCNY, because the college used to select B plus students and admitted only those, whereas now they admit anybody who has passed high school, though they modify that. Anyway, it was a pretty sharp student body, and what happened was that this was really a very tight high school. That is, I had frequently 40 hours of classes a week. And this was really intensive for 40 years.
You know, that's another significant change. Your era and my era, you know, you took 5, 6 courses a semester.
Yeah.
Nowadays, I hear people talking about 2 and 3 or something to that effect. It was a real pretty full day.
I did a lot of my homework on the subways coming and going.
Yeah, I believe
It was
it.
2 hours a day on the subway.
Okay, now, what were you majoring in as an undergraduate?
Well, when I started, I didn't really know. Um, I thought I would go into chemistry and biology, and eventually I did. And at City, I took as much microbiology, as what it's called, bacteriology in those days, and physiology as I could. But I also had a variety of anatomy courses, and also had some chemistry courses.
Okay, now that would be a little different than what you would get as an undergraduate today, I think. Um, I did my undergraduate work in biology, and it was very unusual to have physiology. I did. And it was kind of unusual to have anatomy, and I did do that also. Most didn't do that. Matter of fact, they didn't really start to take any subjects in depth in their major until perhaps well into the junior year and then the senior year kind of thing, and then the first.
I don't remember when I started. I think it must have been about the sophomore year, the second year, that I was able to take some biology courses. But if you were taking biology courses, they started you with things like comparative anatomy and embryology. I did have that sort of stuff in addition to. It wasn't until the junior year and senior year that I got into physiology. And there was a man who was quite good as a teacher, and Chikalis, who was very convincing.
When you say convincing, I'd like to ask you about that, because from a personal standpoint, I was a terrible high school student. I got into college because I was a good football player, and I couldn't take courses of any substance because they didn't think I could pass them. But I had a biology teacher. I knew I was going to have to take biology, and I thought I'd better start it as a freshman because it may take me a couple of years to pass it. I really liked the professor and wanted to do well.
Makes a difference, sure.
And that's what got me switched into the field, and it was kind of a reawakening for me, if you will.
Yeah, but my freshman year, I played tennis for City College.
Okay, so you were combining athletics with academics?
But I had to give up the tennis. I wasn't either good enough or too busy, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't continue with the tennis.
Now, with the kind of schedule you had, were you able to work over the 4-year period when you were in school?
Well, I would help out at the store. I would work behind the fountain on occasion, or do some deliveries or things of this sort.
We're still talking about depression area kinds of things.
Oh, yes.
It was a real luxury to be able to go to school during that period. A lot of people thought, well, gee, I have to work.
This was 32 to 36.
Tough times.
Yeah.
So you filled up your days with the academic side and helping out when you could in the pharmacy sort of
Yes.
thing. Okay. Now, there comes a point when you finish 4 years of college, and again, during that period, that would be considered to be quite an achievement to get all the way through 4 years of.
They didn't handle it that way at City College. It was just grinding out. There were something like 2,100 graduates in 36, and there weren't jobs, there weren't anything. There was no choice. I applied for a few things, but didn't get them. a variety of government things I applied for, including postal clerks, but I didn't get them, so I went to graduate school.
That was the motivation?
Yeah, there wasn't anything else.
And you had decided by that time that the biology and the chemistry fields were the way you wanted to go?
Well, the physiology, and this man Chikalis recommended me to physiology at PNS,
At where?
College of Physicians and Surgeons, Columbia.
Columbia, right. Now I'm curious about that. When you went to Columbia, the old way used to be, you know, you signed up, you went in and spent the first year or two looking for a master's degree and then making a decision as you wanted to go for it. But yours was different, wasn't it?
My folks had told me that they could only support me for that first year in graduate school. That was going to be it. And yeah, so I entered a group of students. There may have been 5 or 6 graduate students in physiology at Columbia, and I went through things like neuroanatomy, various lab courses in physiology. I was supposed to take biochemistry, but since I had had some biochemistry at City College, and Chikalis had stressed what was going on in blood clotting, which was making real progress at that time. I applied to assist somebody in biochemistry who was in blood clotting, involved in blood clotting.
Was that Erwin Chargaff?
Yeah, and that's the obituary I wrote for him for the...
Okay, I'm going to be looking at that.
I think you'll find it interesting.
Now, you know, one of the things that always comes up when we talk about graduate school is when you start to do your study for your thesis and all that, and how it was picked and so forth. How did you get interested in the whole idea of plotting?
Chikalis. It was, things were happening in 34, 35. I mean, there were people at Hopkins who were making real progress in the clotting field, and this was a subject that was sort of booming. And little I knew about what was booming in science, Chikalis played that up, and I was active in a physiology course. So he told me that this was where the action was, and so I thought I could maybe participate in that.
Now, how did you get involved? Did you have to go to Chargaff and say, hey, would you take me on? Or how does that work in your field?
Well, what was happening, you see, was that I had taken a biochemistry course, and I had had that biochemistry. So I went to I don't remember to whom I went, but I did eventually, of course, go to Chargaff and said, I've had most of biochemistry, and I'm going to be taking the exams, but I could do my lab work in your lab if you've got room. And as it happened, Chargaff was really very fortunate. He had come to Columbia fairly recently, 35, 36, as an assistant professor, and he had established, Columbia, biochemistry at Columbia had a chairman by the name of Hans Thatcher Clark, H.T. Clark, who was an organic chemist. He had organized the fine chemicals department of Eastman. He was a first-rate organic chemist in the field of amino acids, particularly protein chemistry. He was a poor lecturer, but he ran a strong department. And he had come to a school which did not undertake to support its professors. Columbia in 35, 34, 35, 36 had no funds. So what he did was to bring in all the refugees, and Chargaff was a refugee, who would work for almost nothing. And when they...
Let me flip this over. We have to use very short tapes because they're archival. And you were saying he brought in all the refugees, and Chargaff was a refugee.
Yeah, who would work for almost nothing, as long as they had a position, which would permit them to eventually grow in the discipline and the business of survival. Well, Chargaff had developed an association with surgery in which he was working on the effect of neutralizing heparin, which was an anti-clotting agent which had been discovered some years ago, particularly by the people at Hopkins, but was being exploited by Hoffman LaRoche, which was at that time in New Jersey. And Chargaff was working with the Hoffman LaRoche people, with surgery, supplementing his income. To what extent that provided his salary and things of that sort, I really don't know. But anyway, he could use a couple of extra hands, and so I was doing some clotting tests and surgery. And he put me in a lab up in surgery, and I would check on clotting times and things like this and try to understand what was going on in the blood clotting field. He thought, I think, that I was a medical student initially. Well, the year was up, and in that summer, the head of physiology was diagnosed as having mercury poisoning and was replaced. And I came in as a student to find out what was going to happen to me. I had been told that I was going to have a position the next year in physiology, a fellowship. And this man, who is now the head of physiology at Columbia, said, well, what have you been doing? So I said, I've been working in blood clotting. He says, blood clotting, blood clotting. And he said, they're doing some good blood clotting work in Kansas. Why don't you go there?
Just right off the bat, pick up and move to Kansas. Now, where did you pick up the skills to do the laboratory work, you know, the cut and paste kind of thing? Because that can be pretty fine technical work.
I did the lab work at City College. I did the lab work at in that first year at Columbia. I wasn't particularly handy, but I wasn't totally inept.
See, I see that as another whole skill set
Yeah,
in that area.
yeah.
Now, okay, after that first year, if you hadn't gotten some kind of help, would that have been the end of it? As far as,
I have no idea. I have no idea. I mean, that was 37 or so. Things were sort of hectic then all over America. Anyway, I went to Chargaff and I told him I needed a job. And he hired me as a bottle washer for $40 a month.
$40 a month, about $10 a week.
And I lived on it for a year. And I took some night courses at Columbia in chemistry, things like physical chemistry, phase rule, etc.
Did that kind of subject come easily to you, or did you really have to work at it?
Really had to work.
You know, for years as a public school teacher, teaching chemistry, I saw so many youngsters that just didn't understand why it just didn't come. You know, why you had, that's why, I'd say, that's why they call them disciplines. You have to work at these things, they're not easy to understand.
Right.
And, I ask that because as an eminent scientist, I like to hear any young folk, or have any young folk person that might listen to this know that you had to work just as hard as the next guy to get this stuff in there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was a struggle that year, but I passed the night courses and adequately and cleaned glassware and developed habits which still apply to my kitchen. Rinsing everything before I put it in the dishwasher.
Yeah, I'm chuckling because having the same kind of background you had, not as extensive, but similar to, I think of washing my hands before I unload the dishwasher. I have rinsed before I put everything in it. Must be something with people that go through the sciences that just come out with this lifelong habit here.
Well, yeah, I mean, part of chemistry, things like, and this was chemistry I learned at City College, qualitative and quantitative analysis. You became conscious of additions and subtractions. I mean, of matter being a real thing, and something that tends to stick on dishes and whatever.
Yep, very true. Now, ultimately through this whole process, you had to come up with a topic for a thesis, research it, and then ultimately defend it. And you did thromboplastic protein from lungs.
No, that was much later.
Was that later?
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
So
While I was washing dishes, I was also learning chemical techniques from Chargaff, and he had me involved in a bunch of things like the degradation of phosphatides by snake venoms and stuff like that. Which is still
what, as blood thinners and clotting and things like that?
No, not really. He actually, the stuff that he was involved in surgery is still in use. That is, there was a case not long ago where somebody was given too much heparin and was bleeding to death, and the technique that he developed, the use of something called protamine to bind the heparin to inactivate it, which he had discovered in the mid-30s, was still being used to save this bleeding person's life last year. So he had made real significant contributions. But chemically, his contributions were, and our chemistry at that time was really quite primitive. It was simple ionic charge being dominant in the events of metabolism. Things are much more complicated now.
I should say, I mean, the minute you say ionic charge, I think you're really going down to the original levels, if you will.
Yes, that's where they were in the 30s.
But you know, you bring up a very important point here, is that an awful lot of that work that was done is not only still useful, but also formed the basis for a lot of the other kinds of things that came along later. You know?
I mean, I remember papers that I read in those years on the discovery of ATP, which was discovered at the American University of Beirut, which were published in the Journal of Biological Chemistry.
Yeah, well, we're going to get into that later on too, because and some of the things that you were working on was before they became really, for lack of a better term, household names.
Well, I was in a department, mind you, which had a predominantly chemical orientation. And the chemistry that was going on proved to be important. For example, one of the refugees, well, there were 4 or 5 German, Austrian refugees in the department, one of whom was Schoenheimer. Rudolf Schoenheimer, was considered to be one of the brightest of these, and he's the guy who introduced the use of isotopes in metabolism. So the first that was being used was Deuterium, because at Columbia, in the chemistry department, deuterium had just become a major activity, the isolation and purification, and Schoenheimer picked that up immediately and brought it to this department in which I was working. Now, mind you, when I say working, that's also something that ought to be understood, because it is something that was unique at the time, not unique at the time, but there was a room, I would say about at least 8 times larger than this, in which there were some 20 laboratory tops. And this was a laboratory which had essentially been designed in the construction of the biochemistry department at Columbia, but had been taken from the image created by Liebig in Germany in the 1840s or so, in which Liebig had the first graduate students, and he had them all in this big laboratory with 20 or more tabletops, and all working together, and the students would learn from each other. That's what the laboratory I was in was like. So instead of learning within a single small room from a professor, I was learning from my fellow graduate students. And the change in that system occurred after 1955, when the granting system began at the NIH, in which people now began to accumulate equipment and separate off into their specialties, and the separation then of graduate students from this big laboratory system into small labs with a professor and an assistant and so forth occurred, which predominates today. And the laboratory at Columbia, at some point in 1960 perhaps, was broken up and separated. But I was in a big lab with 20 or more students, graduate students, and postdoctoral fellows who were now doing graduate work. And the professors, the faculty, would come in once or twice a day to see what their students were doing and what progress was being made and so forth. So this was different.
You know, it strikes me, you were really in a very unique situation back then, because this whole idea of students working with students and helping each other is...
That came from Liebig.
Well, it was right now, it's right in the cutting edge, you know, this is the way you're supposed to do some of these things. And it seems to me there were a couple of things that were happening here. One, when I was teaching, to get a youngster to define what chemistry was, you know, you'd always get that kind of blank look, but you know, chemicals. And I used to tell them, look, physics, force and energy, chemistry, everything else. Everything's a chemical. And it was kind of like that in the area you were. When you talk about bringing deuterium in physiology, you know, bringing these things together, and then having this kind of communal experience, if you will, as a learning tool, I think was really kind of unique and a long way before what some people think of as the best way to educate.
Well, let me tell you who was in that lab, which might be of some interest. Now, Schoenheimer had brought in deuterium, and this was now going to be incorporated, let's say, as deuterium gas into ethylene to make ethane, and that was going to be oxidized or whatever. And this thing was going to be fed to something, to an organism. But first you had to work out the mechanisms so that the detection and analysis of deuterium as water, as the oxidized product, would have to be estimated, and all of these gadgets were being brought in. So Schoenheimer had not only begun with this and had brought in a postdoc who eventually became chairman of the department, and many years later, after Clark died, but in addition, he now began to bring in nitrogen N15, which was the next in line, and that had now to be incorporated into amino acids and fed, and then eventually that got to be C14, and that wasn't until after the war. But when it got to the deuterium part of it, this started with Conrad Bloch Now, Conrad Bloch became a Nobel Prize chemist, and I worked back to back with him for 3 years.
You were having a great experience there.
Yes, I did, but I didn't know it. And the students across the way now had, let's say on the other side of this desk that I was at, now had, one of them had the job of making N15 lysine and feeding that to something and to an organism and see where that lysine went or whether it was metabolized and track down the N15, and that was also a task for the physical chemists in the department to determine where the N15 was. And that would be a 3-year job for a student. That is to take N15 and learn how to put it into an amino acid. Okay, so this guy who now worked not with N15, of course, but with N14, because N15 was relatively rare, and he would spend a year making lysine, learning how to make lysine. And there was some interesting, amusing things about this particular project, because at one point you make an oxime, which now has to rearrange, decompose and rearrange, and both the students and Schoenhammer would get excited, and Clark, who was the super chemist, would come and say, now, Rudy, take it easy, you've got to show the reaction who's boss, and it went like that. You see, anyway, then after you learned how to make it, then you did it again with N15. So that was the second year. In the third year, you now fed it to an animal and found out where the N15 went as lysine. So that was a dissertation. This is the guy right opposite me. Conrad Bloch was right behind me. And meanwhile, I was doing all kinds of nonsense. Now, you must understand that this was a primitive chemical laboratory. That is, we had virtually no gadgetry. There was a vacuum system for distillation. There was really primitive stuff. There was, I think I had some gadget for estimating color reactions, but this was relatively late. This was by 1939, so that was essentially all I had. We did most of our estimations. I did 1 million estimations of phosphate as phosphomolybdates by weight. I used a balance all the time. I was doing primitive chemistry.
But it sounds like it was an enormously rich experience. I mean,
Well,
the different skills and techniques you were picking up were...
I had to learn slowly. that characterized my development. Okay.
But, again, when you describe all this, it just makes me think there was an awful lot of brain power that you were subjected to in this environment that you were in. I mean, you didn't have all the machines, the black boxes, so to speak.
No, there were none of these. There was a centrifuge, which I used occasionally, but by and large there was no gadgetry. It was primitive chemistry, and it worked. And the people who, now, so I was there, let's say, 30, end of 37 to 40 in this chemistry department. And Chargaff took me out of this job, and into another job. We hired another technician who was better equipped than I was to do what he needed. And eventually I got into status as a graduate student and did this work on the thromboplastic protein. And that was interesting. We still don't know what it is that does, but anyway, and all the time I was evolving. There were, let's say, a dozen or more graduate students around, and 3 of whom obtained their doctorate at the same time that I did. One of them was DeWitt Stetton. I don't know whether you've ever heard of Stetton. Stetton became the scientific director of the NIH. There was Block, there was Dave Shemin, who spent a lot of time here. He worked out the fate of nitrogen and hemoglobin, and heme synthesis. And they were first-rate people.
It really sounds that way. You know, I'm wondering, when you're in that pre-doc mode, you do have a mentor professor. And I'm curious as to how the relationship involved, how that person helped you go in certain directions. Just to give you an example, I asked one gentleman, several years ago, who was his mentor at the University of Chicago. He said, well, it was Enrico Fermi. And I said, oh, now that's really interesting. I said, now how did you two communicate in all this? He said, well, essentially, down in the workshop, we had lathes beside each other, and we would be working on these lathes, and he would occasionally grunt something to me, you know. And how was it with you, with the person that was kind of directing you?
That's why I brought this obituary I wrote of Chargaff, because I think that'll give you more of a feel for that.
Okay, so then at some point we might come back to that again,
Yeah,
okay?
Chargaff was very kind, really. And because he really had a tough road to hoe there. I wasn't very knowledgeable, and he helped me develop without tossing me out.
I think you're being very modest with all this. But it sounds like you had basically what I would have to think of as a very high-powered, very rich pre-doctoral experience at Columbia. And then that day comes when you finally have that dreamed about certificate, the doctorate. Then you have to make another big decision, and you're like, what am I going to do now?
Well, mind you, I was now at that point in 1940, and I had been working and doing interesting things, I thought, on clotting. And there was a war going on. So I applied to a large number of pharmaceutical companies, telling them that I was an expert in the clotting business, and none of them had jobs. None of them were interested. And now, and at that time I was reading things that enlarged my vistas, you might say, and one of which was because it was an 1934, 5, and afterwards that Stanley had discovered and crystallized tobacco mosaic files.
Which was a pretty significant thing.
Yeah. So after I got all these rejections from the pharmaceutical companies,
At that point, you were thinking of a straight commercial career?
yeah, there was nothing else available. The government, academia, didn't know really how to support science.
Hmm.
So I picked up a copy of Science and noted the existence of a new set of fellowships to train people in disciplines relating to virology. And so I made application to Wendell Stanley at Princeton.
That was at the Rockefeller Institute?
Yeah. And so in making this application, I now had a couple of interviews. One was with Homer Smith at NYU.
The Homer Smith that,
No.
oh, okay.
Homer Smith was an important kidney physiologist. And I apparently passed his scrutiny and reported to Stanley that now the fellowships, which were organized by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis.
This is gonna flip, so we'll change it. Need to stretch or anything?
No, I'm okay, thank you. Well, what time is it? It's
I tell you, I try to keep these to no more than 2 hours because everybody gets a little dingy, you know?
They do?
Oh, the only one that never did, there was a gentleman named Arnold Ahrens that first came to the oceanographic back in the 40s, a newly minted PhD, and he came summers, but spent most of his career teaching at Amherst College. And he came in one day, and we were going to do his oral history, and he said, I only have today before I have to go back to Washington State again. So he kept going for 8 hours. I mean, I was totally exhausted, and he was still going. And he was a good 14 years older than I was.
So how are you doing now?
Dr. Cohen, you were talking about your postdoctoral fellowship at the Rockefeller Institute with Wendell Stanley and explaining what it was all about. When you apply for a fellowship, what is a fellowship going to give you?
An income. And it was going to expose me to some new field, but I didn't really think about that very much. I mean, really, in those years, I was interested in income and nothing else. That was, I wouldn't say nothing else, but that was dominant.
Well, you know, I've heard that from everybody that grew up through the Depression years. The need to have some kind of income. It really became almost a fundamental part of their being.
Well, what had happened had been polio epidemic, which had led to the formation of the Polio Foundation. And in 1936, the foundation decided to organize a scientific committee. And there was a man by the name of Tom Rivers, who was vice president of the Rockefeller Institute, in charge of the hospital, who was the chairman. Now, the book on Rivers is an oral history by a man named Saul Benison. Benison is thought to be the founder of oral history.
Was it done at Columbia?
No. Benison eventually moved to Cincinnati.
You know, I only ask that because Columbia is considered to be the center of oral history.
He begins at Columbia. There is a write-up on that in this book on Tom Rivers. And the scientific committee met in 1937 and the subsequent years, and then undertook to form, said that its first job would be to pull together a community of scientists knowledgeable about viruses. And they had put this notice in Science, and I was one of the first 3 applicants. And in 1940, I was appointed to this position. Meanwhile, I had gone out to Stanley and told him I was interested in what he had been doing, and that I was particularly interested in discovering what the role of the nucleic acid was in tobacco mosaic virus. Now, without knowing it, Stanley had gotten into a real scientific jam over the nucleic acid. When he analyzed tobacco mosaic virus in 1935, he couldn't find any phosphorus in it, and he couldn't find any nucleic acid. And it wasn't until 1938 that somebody working with Stanley now was able to repeat some English workers' findings that there was nucleic acid, RNA in the virus. And when I said that I was interested in that nucleic acid, I was going to be extending the work of the guy who had, named Loring, I guess his name was, who had found nucleic acid in Stanley's preparations. So he said, well, he said if there was some group of scientists connected with the foundation, if they said I was probably good enough, he said, fine, I'll take them on. So he accepted me, and in spring 1941.
And you know, it wasn't for a good 20 years that DNA, RNA became household words. So you were really a long way before the curve there.
Well, in 41, it had not been known that nucleic acid, that RNA, for example, was a large molecule. The methods of isolation, which usually involve alkali, degraded RNA so that you had no molecules larger than 4 nucleotides, tetranucleotides. So in 42, I isolated the RNA of tobacco mosaic virus and discovered it was a very, very large molecule. And Stanley and I published that. So in 42, that was the first discovery of a large RNA.
Yeah, that, as I say, that was really early work on that. That was very interesting. The other thing you mentioned was I'm working with poliovirus, and
No,
you know,
I never worked with polio.
no, I know you had mentioned the term. I'm trying to put people that are listening to this into some kind of environment where they understand what it was like then. And today someone would use polio as a term, but I can clearly remember back then we used to call it infantile paralysis. And every summer, I remember missing out my first trip to New York because New York had reported its 700th case of infantile paralysis, and my parents didn't want to take a chance. I can remember at traveling fairs, they had a woman in an iron lung as one of the exhibits, you know, and things like this. So different times, kind of thing. That's, you know, when you talk about isolating RNA back in the early 40s, that really kind of made me sit back a little bit here.
Yeah, well, in 42. Nobody refers to that really, but they should.
Yeah, that's why I went like this, you know.
Well, but before that, you see, there I was in a new lab, relatively isolated, and now I had to start to learn lots of new things. Now, my training with Chargaff had been largely on lipids. Now I was dealing without any lipids. I was now involved in nucleotides, but there was this charge business. So one of the things I had done in my dissertation was to add heparin to the thromboplastic protein, which was a particle really containing some RNA. And the RNA was pushed off and the heparin bound to the thromboplastic protein, to these particles. So I figured when I got to Stanley's lab, I would try that out. But incidentally, he assigned me a thing to do to test me. Somebody had just reported that given tobacco mosaic virus, if you treated it in a certain way with proteolytic enzymes, not proteolytic, with a phosphatase, yeah. You knocked off the RNA that was on the surface, and you ended up with a protein that was completely devoid of RNA. Okay? Now, this was coming from Germany. This was a guy named Schramm, who was now doing work which seemed to explain Stanley's initial inability to discover RNA in his virus, because he had a particle that was the size of tobacco mosaic virus, but devoid of RNA. So Stanley got me to do that as the very first thing when I came in.
What's your reaction? What was your reaction when you were hit with a problem like that? I mean, was it, whew?
No. I worked at it. I mean, this was something I had to do, this was my job. So I tried to repeat it, and it couldn't be repeated. Couldn't be repeated for a number of reasons. One of which was that there was a gross error in the paper on the pH at which things were happening. And I didn't know any German. So I sort of had fits, but it became clear that this thing was a fraud. That Schramm was a fraud. So the first paper I published with Stanley denied called this paper a fraud. Now Schramm was in a lab, a German lab, which was competing with Stanley. And this was in 1941, 42, 43, 44. And this guy never acknowledged the existence of this paper, which we published in the Journal of Biological Chemistry. Yeah.
You know, it's really interesting that in some respects, science is almost a contact sport. There is competition between labs and scientists. And
Well, this was more than that. I mean, after all, this guy in Germany now had to report the existence of a paper by Cohen and Stanley denying his report. So that, now, anyway, unless you want to ask anything more about that, we'll drop it there.
well, now, you know, I'm always curious when you start your really in the beginning parts of your career and you start to do those first publications and you're the principal author and all that, that must be a real thrill.
Well, it was clear after 5 years at Columbia that at P&S that authorship was an important part of one's career. I mean, Chargaff really worked very hard on papers, writing papers.
Was that a skill you had to learn? I mean, it's
Oh yeah, and I don't think I've learned it.
you know, the reason I asked that, I've had a number of people who I consider very, very highly in terms of their scientific abilities talk about the difficulties they had in their writing.
Sure.
So, what was the whole process with you? How did you learn to write an acceptable paper as a first author?
I showed it to somebody else to correct.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, my wife was very helpful with that.
From the sentence construction point of view and all that, not
Yeah,
the science
sure.
part of it. Sure. Okay. Now you were at the Rockefeller Institute for 2 years.
Well, in 42, well, no, this first job was this business with with Schramm's report. The second, while I was trying to figure out how to do this nucleic acid thing, now, mind you, I was at the Rockefeller Institute. I had 400 tobacco plants a week and 100 French bean. These were for estimation of virus. And I was grinding out lots of virus and analyzing and estimating and so forth. So the only plants I really know are tobacco and French. Okay, but I was now getting all these viruses around. And so I decided to see whether the trick I had done with heparin on thromboplastic protein would work on some of these viruses which had nucleic acid. So I threw in some heparin, and then these things crystallized. And I now found that I could crystallize almost everything. Now mind you, I was not a good organic chemist with experience in crystallization, but now I could crystallize almost every protein I looked at. Heparin did this. And how it did this is still an important subject. It's now called steric exclusion, or should be called, but it's begun to be taken up by a lot of contemporary biochemists for the following reason. Heparin is a molecule of it's a polysaccharide with lots of sulfates on it, so when one heparin gets to another, it doesn't merge with it, but it occupies volume. And all the heparin molecules surrounding a protein compress the protein molecules into smaller and smaller space. So now, when they get packed enough, when the proteins get packed enough, they crystallize. And in 41 and 42, I was crystallizing everything in sight.
In other words, you discovered kind of a magic bullet,
That's right, steric exclusions. And okay. So, somebody in England, a physical chemist by the name of Ogston, subsequently rediscovered that in the 50s and called it steric exclusion. And
did he reference you?
I don't remember. But subsequently, biochemists now had to confront the problem of what happens in a cell when you make polysaccharides, like glycogen. What happens when you've got nucleic acid there? What do you have packing phenomena as a result of cell metabolism?
See, these are all still hot issues you're talking about here.
That's right, and still exists. And there aren't enough people working in this field. That's something I had discovered by accident in 42, 41, yeah. But as a result of that experience, I began to get a feel for how one might get to the nucleic acid of tobacco mosaic virus, and I began to learn things about proteins and crystals, and I began to do things like electrophoresis and sedimentation, ultraviolet sedimentation and diffusion and whatnot. So I had to bust open the tobacco mosaic virus, and the nucleic acid would come out and then look at what was liberated. And when I did that, I had initially this very large nucleic acid, hundreds of thousands molecular weight, 1,000 nucleotides instead of 4. So we now had a big RNA. Now, I had 400 tobacco plants, and I had the ultracentrifuge. Now, I could have taken that stuff and put it on the tobacco plants and found out that it was infectious. But I didn't do that. I rushed it to the ultracentrifuge to discover how big it still was.
Okay, why did you do that?
Because the dominant theory of the time was that nobody knew anything about nucleic acid being a genetic material.
I mean, it seems to me that you've opened a Pandora's box of a whole bunch of new techniques, ways of doing these things. Or am I off here?
No. That's what the Polio Foundation had discovered, essentially, by putting me in that position.
Because back in those days, the big issue, as I recall, was trying to isolate this stuff so that they could find out how you could
No,
kill it.
not in the 40s. It wasn't, I mean, these things didn't become important until the 50s and 60s.
Okay. Okay, now, finishing up there, you still have to make another decision.
Well, the war was on. It
Right.
just started in the end of 41. I had, I remember going out at nights into the fields looking for Japanese airplanes.
Wearing one of those white helmets?
No helmets. And anyway, Chargaff called me and said he had been asked to look at the rickettsia, the typhus vaccine. And at that time, we thought the agents of typhus were viruses. Rickettsia could not be multiplied outside of intact cells. They could not be multiplied on plates. They were not behaving like just ordinary bacteria. So would I now work under the Army program on the typhus vaccine?
A lot of this that they were looking at now was looking for answers to different kinds of injuries, diseases, and things like this.
No, the Army had this problem of sending troops to North Africa, which was rich in typhus.
Right.
And so there was this typhus vaccine. There was this thing called the Cox vaccine. Now you make the typhus vaccine by injecting embryonated eggs, and the endothelium was now rich in rickettsia. Now you broke open these eggs and homogenized this with some phenol or formaldehyde, and now you extract it with ether, and what was the aqueous phase was now the vaccine.
Okay.
99.5% egg protein. And the Germans and the English were reporting that this was killing off their vaccine recipients. So my job was to get rid of egg material. Now, with Chargaff, I had done a lot of work with eggs and this venom business and lysophosphatides. I had this business of getting rid of lipids, which was what the ether was all about. So I knew about lipids, I knew about viruses. I was perfect for the typhus vaccine. Okay. So I now went back to Columbia to isolate typhus antigens.
That was in 42?
Yeah.
and your title then was a research associate in biochemistry.
Yeah,
Were you gonna do any teaching too?
no,
Okay, so it's still the research part of the career,
yeah.
purely, okay.
So, now, one thing which I had learned in connection with the Rockefeller was I had become close to a man by the name of Moses Kunitz. Kunitz was the guy who had been the assistant to Jacques Loeb, who was here, began a physiology course here. And in 1912, Kunitz had come to America fleeing the Tsar. And Kunitz and Loeb had picked up Kunitz while he was going to school at the what's the name of this place downtown Manhattan? There's a school, technical school. Anyway, eventually Kunitz goes to Columbia and gets his PhD in biochemistry in 1924, the year that Loeb died. And the head of Loeb's department at the Rockefeller, now Kunitz was probably a genius. He did all the important chemistry and math that Loeb eventually did. He probably did it all as Loeb's assistant. That's my guess. And the department was now turned over to Northrop. Northrop also worked here. So Kunitz and Northrop lived around here. And Kunitz had a home on Falmouth Heights. I don't know where Northrop, but anyway, by 26, Northrop decided to move Loeb's Department of General Physiology to Princeton. And so there are two buildings at the Rockefeller in Princeton, one of which is plant physiology, not plant physiology, but plant